joined today by Gavin Harrison Sounds, the person behind the PC Building Simulator number 2 soundtrack. Hi Gavin, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Not too bad today. Hope you're doing well yourself.
I'm doing very well, thanks for asking. So PC Building Simulator number 2, it's been out for quite some time. And obviously they approached you during the early development of the game and asked for your involvement in building a soundtrack and things regarding that. How did that feel?
It's pretty good. I did PC Building Simulator 1, and that was a smaller scale soundtrack. And you always hope when you do the first one, you get asked back to do the second one. So I kind of thought I must have done a good enough job to be involved in this one again. So yeah, it was good. It's good to be working back on it because it was such a varied soundtrack to do.
Yeah, yeah. So when you got that call and they said, right, we love what you do with PC Building Sim, would you like to be involved in PC Building Sim 2? It was like, oh, yes, please, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as I said, because of the variety of the soundtrack, and I was, I knew it would be a similar kind of setup to the first one. I just jumped at the chance. So, and also it came around. I think it was around 2020. I think. So it just sort of came at a time when everybody was starting to work from home.
Yeah.
So it was just a great project to take on. What was a good time, I suppose, for me.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, you say 2020. Unfortunately, COVID, remote working, and things like that. Did that limit the kind of thing you could do, or did it make it easier for you?
It did limit it a bit. I mean, obviously, when I say a good time for me, it's sort of on a personal kind of work level. It suited everything that was going on at the time. I mean, it was a bad time for the country, certainly.
Yeah, well, for the world.
There were a few. Because I worked with collaborators, it did make getting together in person quite difficult. So there was a lot of the sort of the file swapping and all the rest of it. And one collaborator in particular I've worked with before, and it's been fine. But I don't know. You can never say you would have got something better because you're never going to know. But I think it would have been nicer if I could have been in the studio with people face to face sometimes. Absolutely. But I think. Yeah. At the end of the day, we got a great result anyway. So
that's right. I mean, you've mentioned obviously collaborators and stuff like that. We'll touch upon that a little bit later on in regards to who you worked with and how it was working with them and things. In regards of the music side of things, what's your interest in music and where did it come from?
I mean, going right back. I mean, my dad is a massive hi-fi buff. And just loves all music. I mean, he's got a cylinder player. As he's sort of got older, he's collected more records, tapes, CDs. I mean, I often think he's on a mission to collect and catalogue every piece of music ever written. So I was, yeah. So I was brought up in a sort of house where there was a lot of music going on, particularly in the evenings. My dad's the sort of person who would. In the evenings, I remember going to bed and trying to go to sleep, and he'd be put on an album, and he'd sit in a chair with his eyes shut and just listen to it from start to finish. So, there is an inbuilt love.
Literally sit there, close your eye, and just enjoy the music.
Yeah, that's definitely some of my earliest memories. And then I actually started on a ZX Spectrum of all things.
Wow, that brings back memories.
Yeah. So I sort of started off doing a bit of programming, but quite badly. I got quite proficient in BASIC, and I tried to step up to doing machine code and all the rest of it. And just I don't know what it was, if it was an age or whatever. I couldn't quite get my head around it. And at the time, I remember really wanting to get the new Nintendo console, the Mega Drive, or whatever. We're talking late '80s, early time.
Yeah.
And my parents, much to their credit, were quite insistent that I have a computer I could, type on and do things with and all the rest of it.
So you went down the avenue with the Spectrums and the Ataris.
Yeah, I mean, my dad had again, the influence there, had like an old rubber keyed Spectrum, which we'd grown up with and played things like Ant-Attack and stuff throughout the early mid '80s on. I had this Spectrum, and I started getting into the public domain demo scene, and it was because there was a copy of a program called Sound Tracker on the Your Sinclair cover tape, if I remember rightly. So I just started mucking around with that and essentially started writing music for PD demos. And yeah, I mean that's kind of the very early basics, and then sort of leaping ahead massively. I did the usual, music at school, learnt piano, or taught myself keyboards,
Mhm.
and then taught myself a bit of guitar, and then sort of did the whole gigging band in my teens, unsuccessful pub gigs and whatnot, and venues where there's more people in the band than the crowd.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Getting yourself established in that, right? Have you got any like particular favourite artist, or what you would say would be your go-to when you're actually listening to music?
Oh, right. I mean, I probably shouldn't admit this. I tend not to listen to too much music when I've been working all day. But my favorite time, if I'm going to listen, is in the car.
Mhm.
And if I can get through the Spotify playlist, because my kids listen to it, and it's loads of Pokemon songs on there.
Yeah.
Eventually, I get to what I want to listen to. And I would say some of my favorite artists are kind of like the mid '90s almost, dancing as an Orbital, Left Field,
Yeah.
Massive Attack. I'm a huge Massive Attack fan.
Mhm.
And then there's I actually sort of stopped writing music in my 20s, and my friend went to a festival in Spain called Sonar Festival, and he came back with this mixtape, and it had a band called Telefon Tel Aviv on it. And I listened to this music, and it completely reinvigorated my love for music again because of the way it was written. So I put Telefon Tel Aviv in there as well.
Telephone Tel Aviv 90s.
They were kind of early. They were late '90s, early
90,
2000s.
yeah, 98 turn of the centennium kind of thing, weren't they?
Yeah. What was the song that got me back in was called "Sound in the Dark Room." Can't remember the name of their first album, but yeah, I've always been a fan of their music because I just found it amazing what that kind of glitchy style.
Yeah.
I absolutely loved it. But if I had to pull, if I had a desert island band, it would probably be Massive Attack. Mezzanine's my all-time favorite album.
Is that your go-to, is it?
I mean, it's quite a dark album, but
Yeah,
it
I was
has
going to say, yeah, it is a bit of to put it into polite content. It has a selective listener kind of based as that sort of music.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I think from start to finish that is almost a perfect album, and to me, it doesn't sound dated considering when it was written. And every time I listen to it, I will pick out something new in it.
yeah,
But I mean, if I'm being completely honest, a lot of the time when I'm driving, I mean, I did a long drive the other day, and I was listening to sort of early '90s dance hits like "Rhythm of the Night" by Corona and things. So
oh,
there is lighter stuff in there as well.
Corona, Snap,
Yeah.
Black Box, yeah.
Culture, the whole lot.
Culture Beat, yeah, the list of the
Yeah,
early
yeah,
90s dance is absolutely endless. You mentioned about the Spectrum back in the early days.
yeah.
In regards to like the equipment you've got for the music and stuff, how has that kind of gone from the Spectrum to current day?
Wow. I mean, when I had the Spectrum, not only did I soundtrack it, but and I can't remember how, why, or where I found out about this, but I noticed around the back there was a MIDI port on the plus two I had at the time. So I built my own MIDI lead by cutting off end of a typical 5-pin socket, and the other
Yeah,
end it's like a telephone socket. So I connected up my Spectrum to my first synth, which was a Roland D10, I think. And I used to sit and program the Spectrum to play the D10. And when there was too much going on, it would slow down and do all sorts. But it worked, and that was kind of my first, I don't
how?
know, like computer but using a keyboard sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how that
Um,
actually managed to work. Because from memories of myself having the plus two and even the plus three, on the plus two, wasn't the MIDI socket specifically for a tape deck?
no, I mean you had a separate tape deck. Is it an RS-232 type socket around the back? But it was labelled that slash MIDI. You plugged your light gun into it, I think.
Right.
Because
Yes. Yes.
the
Yes.
plus two I got was the James Bond set. So I can
Memories.
remember it. Yeah, so and then you had to do like just using the play command. I just can't remember off the top of my head quite how you sent it down the right cable. But I remember because if you were writing a 3-minute song, you couldn't just click and get to 2 minutes 30 to check a bit. You had to listen right from the start
Yeah.
every single time you changed anything. So it was a good learning
Yeah.
process. But
Not
But I
like
mean,
it
yeah,
is today, where you've got software where you can move a slider across and go, okay, that sounds fine. That sounds a bit crap. I can cut that out and layer over it. Back then, like you say, it was hit record, do what you had to do, stop it, rewind it, listen through to it again, and if it didn't sound how you wanted it to, you had to start from scratch.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, from there, I mean, there's quite a jump to where I am now, so I don't know how in depth you want to go into that. But I certainly at that time I had a friend as well. He had did he? Yeah, he got an Atari, I think, and we were using Notator because that's what we used at school as well. So that, which is the precursor to what Logic is now.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my first foray, and then yeah, I mean, I can go into detail now, but there's a lot more stuff now.
Yeah. I mean, Atari, was it the 520 or the 520 FX?
Yeah, I think so, and you could get the extra upgrades. I mean, people swear by their timing to this day, MIDI wise. So yeah, I know some people who still use them. In fact,
Yeah, I mean, interesting. You mentioned Atari. I had an Atari when I was younger, and
right?
it was the upgraded one. It was the FM version.
Okay.
And the thing I can specifically remember with the Ataris, I don't know if it was the same for yourself. Obviously, getting yourself established in creating music and things. The coding for them, if you wanted to do your own game on there, you had like 200 pages of coding just to get the game to work.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, certainly when it came to the Spectrum, I mean the coding and that side of things. I mean, it just went. You know, it wasn't something that I couldn't quite get my head around how to do it all in the end. Which, you know, but it's not like I just went, oh, I can't do this. I'm going to do music instead. I'd always had an interest in music, but I guess things just happened at the right time in that respect.
Yeah, yeah. So we've mentioned the Spectrum, we've mentioned the Atari. Now we've been reliably informed that you have a lot of vintage studio equipment. You've got some amazing analog systems and sound effects. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So I'm just looking. I'm sitting in the room with them now. I'm just looking around. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what happened really. So, it started. I'd always wanted like a Rhodes, an old electric piano, and do you know what? I got quite ill and ended up in hospital. I'm absolutely fine, but I remember being in there and just thinking, do you know what? As soon as I can, if I'm lucky enough to afford this, life is too short kind of thing. And I know it's very corny, yeah, but it really was like that. So I started looking at Rhodes the moment I came out of hospital, and I ended up one way or another, all quite random again, going. I don't know if you remember a band called Apollo 440.
Oh yes.
Dance act. Yes. So I ended up going to see their Rhodes. Didn't realise it was them until I got down there, and they had this sort of slightly beaten up Juno 106 sitting in the corner. Didn't buy the Rhodes, but I bought the 106 instead, and I brought it back to where I was working at the time, a little studio. Started playing with it. I knew it was a bit wonky, but it properly went wrong after a few days, and I thought, I'm going to have to take this, you know, miles, hundreds of miles to get repaired. You know, it's a old instrument, all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And this is all very relevant, by the way, as you'll discover. And
no,
I started Googling like vintage synth repairs, blah, blah, and it turned out that there was one 3 miles from my home. So there's a brilliant guy called Synth Prof who lives just down the road. But because of that, I then knew that I could buy these old keyboards and know that I had someone nearby reliable, because reliable synth tech are quite difficult to come across.
Yeah.
Who could fix them. And I think that's half the battle. I don't, if I didn't have Andy down the road, I don't think I would have half the Oh yeah, there you go. Sorry. Yeah, that's Synth Prof Andy. He's a lovely man. I don't think I would have half the equipment I've got, because they do go wrong. But anyway, was
it one of those things where it went wrong and you were sat there with your head in your hands? I've just spent X amount of pounds to get something that I've really wanted. Now what am I going to do? Moment.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, on the final, I mean, luckily it was a time prices were still taken off by this point, but they hadn't taken off, especially not for the 106, which, I mean, I just think they go for too much money these days. But, you know, I only paid at the time a few hundred for it. So it is a bit of money.
Yeah.
But compared to what they go for these days, it wasn't a lot. They do go for silly amounts, as I said. The other thing with having the repairer down the road is he will get keyboards in that he repairs that he knows people are looking to sell on, and if he gets one, I'm half interested, and I don't know, like I've got the right amount of work coming in or the finances allow, then it's a bit of a perfect storm in terms of getting another keyboard.
Right. So he's got that upseller kind of thing where he would get it in from someone, do the work to it, and then sell it on to somebody.
Yeah, I mean, it's more.
That's the perfect kind of contact to have.
It is. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm not saying. I just think about all the things I'd have if I didn't have the keyboards. I wouldn't have as much joy. That's why I wouldn't have.
Very true. Very true. And you wouldn't be where you are now.
Well, yeah. There is that. Yeah. I mean, he doesn't specifically try and sort of upsell, but it's more that someone like the last. I'm trying to think of the one before last. I've got an Obi XA, so one of the really old Oberheims from the early '80s, and it was a guy in Ireland who was selling it, and he'd owned it from new as record producer, and he was looking to get it repaired and sold on. So he found Andy, took it to Andy, and Andy then sort of I can't remember what I'd taken in there. I gig occasionally with a D50 of all things, and it sometimes needs repairs, and I probably took it in, and Andy just says, "By the way, I've got this keyboard in from such and such a person. He's looking to sell it. Are you interested?" And that's normally how these conversations start, and then course of 6 months, it becomes a good idea in my head to buy another keyboard.
Right. Okay. Now, 6 months it becomes a good idea in your head to buy another keyboard. Out of all the equipment that you've currently got in the studio, is there anything that you've actually gone and specifically purchased for PC Building Sim 1 and 2?
Interesting story, that one. So, not so much for 1. But for 2, yes. So when I started out writing the second soundtrack, I at the time was going to be doing all the writing, all the mixing, and everything, and so I bought a few bits of outboard to do the mixing with. So there's a couple of distresses, some nice preamps. I'm trying to think. I'm just looking around me now. Like a few, effects units and stuff. And then, as it was, when I started completing songs, I remember getting to about mix 15 on one song, and I just couldn't get it right because I'd sat with it for too long. And I ended up, I think one night I was trying to go to sleep, and it just popped into my head just to outsource the mixing to a couple of good friends of mine. So I bought this outboard to do it with. Then I didn't mixer it. I did, however, use them for tracking through. So when I was recording a keyboard part or something, I would still run it through the equipment. So whilst I didn't use them for their initial use, they then got some very good use recording the music in itself. So everything worked out well in the end.
It's just the sort of thing if you sat there and you're like, that doesn't sound right, I'm going to go back to it later. You go back to it later, it still doesn't sound right. You left it for a bit, and then one night, massive brainwave. Oh, let's try this.
I think just I can. So I know I can mix. I have tracks out there and all the rest of it. But there are sometimes you just. I don't know if it's that old adage of just getting too close to something, or I mean, a part of me just thought this would be better with another set of ears around it. I've done a rough mix of it, so there is a direction there. But there are people that I know and trust who can also mix, and it was a matter of just like, do you know what? I think it will benefit the soundtrack. I mean, initially it was just kind of going to be one song, and in the end, I was like, do you know what? I think this would be great. Whole soundtrack is mixed by. I said there's 2 other people involved, mixed by other people, because I think it will be better for it. And then it's sort of, I don't know. Sometimes when I'm writing, when I know I'm going to be mixing later, I don't know if I restrict myself. I write in a different way, and I felt just a bit more freed up when I knew I wasn't going to be mixing it. I don't know. It just unblocked something in my mind, and I felt happier writing the rest of the songs at this point.
Did you get to the point where you thought you had writer's block?
Do you know what? I didn't. It's not so much writer's block. It's almost like decision making. Like there are a couple of tracks where, you sort of you don't want to commit to anything and then as soon as you
lay something down and you're like, do I really want to put my name to that? Because it doesn't sound like my best kind of work, sort of a feeling.
A bit of that, but also a bit of sort of decision making when you're choosing an effect or something. Like you go back in and you just tweak a reverb by a tiny amount or something, little
Hmm.
effect, and you can get really hung up on that sort of thing. Whereas the moment I'd sort of given it to someone else, I knew I could on my draft mix just put a reverb on there, and that they would make it better in inverted commas. But
Yeah, yeah.
if and if I didn't like it, I could say to them, no, actually, I preferred it this way, and that was fine. It sort of took some decision making off me, which I liked at that point.
Nothing wrong with that at all. And they do say that in some cases, getting a second pair of ears to have a listen to what you've created and come back and say, you know what, maybe change this or make that bass tone that small little fraction higher and things like that. So what you're doing there, from what you've just explained to us, is you're layering certain levels of different vocals down and things like that. If it is a vocal soundtrack under non-copywritten or even instrumental, and then you're going, I'm not completely happy with that. Let's let somebody else have a listen and see if they can give me any points and tips and things. And that, even with mainstream artists, I know a few artists that have actually done that kind of thing, and it 9 times out of 10 comes back with actually a better soundtrack than what you thought it was originally going to be.
Yeah, definitely, and I think in terms of mixing, I mean, it's not just getting the levels balanced. There is still a creative element
Oh, of
in
course,
the
yeah.
person who's mixing, and yeah, and it's nice to they might bring. I don't know. It could be a creative delay, like a throw delay, or something that, or just putting an instrument to one side, or something that I wouldn't necessarily thought of doing.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there was one track in particular where I'd run the vocal through a lot of different effects, and I couldn't quite work out which one I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
So I sent it to the person who mixed that one's called Jeff, and I just sent it to him, and I just said, pick the one that you think's best.
Mm-hmm.
And they're probably all incredibly similar, but it just was one less decision for me to make, and I could concentrate on the other bits which needed my attention more, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So when you actually come to creating a track or a soundtrack for anything at all, is there anything that you would say would be your favourite go-to piece of equipment?
It's usually the last piece of equipment I bought, I think. I don't know if there is. I mean, I will normally start pretty much in the box. I mean, I use Pro Tools on a Mac and something like Omnisphere. I'm quite a harmonic, melodic sort of person, so I might even just start with a of piano plugin and just start mucking around melodies before I start putting them out to different instruments.
Yeah.
And then, in terms of the sort of the go-to part of that, the one nice thing about having a lot of different synths, but also knowing their characteristics, because they are all different, even though some people say they're not, is you know which one's going to get you the sound you want.
Oh,
So I would
in
then
regards
dial
of
in.
yeah, in regards of synthesizers, you're spot on with what you're saying. Every synthesizer has its own reverb tone to it, um, and every synthesizer, even though they're programmed in a kind of generic form, they never sound the same when you go to any two. So if you say like go to a Yamaha, for example, and then you go across to a classic, they there's no way you could sit there and say a Yamaha could recreate a classic.
No, I mean,
They do definitely sound different.
yeah, I mean, a lot of these will go out of tune as well, depending on the temperature of the room. So I can't remember. There was one track I did where I recorded the entire part. It was like half a semitone out or something, and I'd already lost the sound, so I had to adjust it in software. And there's little things like that that come in. So yeah, they're interesting bits of gear. But yeah, I would just sort of go to the synth that I then want from there. And before you know it, I mean, sometimes you'll get a little part going and eventually do away with everything you've just done, but it will lead you to starting something new. So
Yeah,
it's quite an organic process. I know it's a almost obvious thing to say, but you've just got to follow what happens, and you can have a day writing and nothing can come out, but you need that day writing of nothingness to produce the idea the following day, sort of thing. So I had quite a lot of fun. I've got an old delay unit, um sort of digital delay from the late 70s, early 80s, but it does harmony as well, and it does like stereo widening on vocals, so I had quite a lot of fun with that on a few tracks.
I was going to mention that. Have you actually used vocoder for anything that you've done?
I haven't. I mean, this isn't specifically vocoder. It sort of it changes the pitch ever so slightly on the left and the right, and then you've got the center one. It's kind of known as a classic Phil Collins vocal effect because
Yeah.
he used it on quite a lot of things. It does that vocal doubling.
Right.
So I used it on. There's a track called "On the Floor," which I used it on, and there's a sort of '80s sounding track called "No Fear of Falling," which it got used on quite a bit as well.
Okay, so it sounds from the whole thing you've got quite a vast creating process when you actually sit down and start layering a track and things like that. So in regards of making game soundtracks, is it different from other things in regards of like if you was to ask to make a backing soundtrack for a mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of with my other hat on do sort of some TV work, and with the game soundtrack, I mean, actually not so much with PC Building Sim 2, because the way that soundtrack was constructed, you've kind of got to. Well, not it's difficult. Not for every game. I was going to say you've got to sit in the zone for some games where you've kind of got to be in the background, but also be good, but not be too repetitive, but also can only be a minute loop, and but also be catchy. It can be a challenge. Actually getting that looping element, and also of course you've got things like adaptive soundtracks where you've got these layers that can come in and out, and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So that's always something to think about. But with the PC Building Sim 2 soundtrack, it was because it was like a radio station within the game itself. It was very much like writing tracks with beginnings and ends that were full tracks in the normal
Yeah.
sense. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, rather than doing like you say a 30 second to a minute catchy loop that keeps people going, oh, this has got a bit of a beat to it. You're going into your 2.5, 3 minute long kind of segments, aren't
Yeah,
you?
yeah.
How hard was that?
Um, I I loved it. To do a soundtrack where you're asked to write specific songs in so many different genres as well.
Yeah.
Was just absolutely brilliant. It was a sort of a change, but a good change at the time, of and challenging, but in a good way because it was. I don't know. It was like here's a trance genre, here's a sort of rock grunge genre, here's a dance, here's a trip hop, and all these
Yeah.
different genres.
Yeah.
Try and get them all, and
So they asked
I
you
worked
to cater for every single genre out there.
as many as we could. I worked with a guy called Phil, who a lot of our chats just ended up being about music when we were sort of specking out what the soundtrack should be, and he has a personally think a fantastic taste in music, and some of our musical background is similar. So there would be a lot of sharing kind of links and things, and being a bit, and I loved being introduced to lots of new music at the time. And then sometimes I'd know some of it, but it would be, don't know, possibly some obscure group or something no one else had heard of. So it was, I really enjoyed that process. Really enjoyed it.
Right. Okay. Now, on the process itself, from day one, sitting down, writing the music, and obviously layering it, producing everything else like that, the question that every single producer and creator hates to be asked: how long does it take to go from start to finish?
Oh wow, yeah, yeah. I don't mind being asked that. I just think it's almost impossible to answer, isn't it? You know, if you took out sort of the days where nothing's happening, like you might have sent a file off and you're waiting for someone to mix it, for instance, and there's nothing going on. I mean, some tracks can come about in days, and then it can just be that last little bit which takes forever to do. And other tracks can just sort of gradually come to being over a space of a few months. There's one track in particular on this. I think I mentioned earlier, called "On the Floor," and that was an interesting one because it started off and I had this big long kind of intro build up, and it was about a minute and a half, 2 minutes long, and I thought this is great, and I sent that off to Matt, who did the vocals. He came back with this great kind of line, and I was like, right, that's our verse, we're going to need a chorus. So I started trying to arrange the song, and it took me weeks on and off, and a lot of times I'd do a day and get nowhere with it and just have to leave it for a week, and I just could not get the arrange right. And then it just sort of clicked in my head, and I just thought, this doesn't doesn't need a chorus. I just need the verses and then instrumental bits. And once I had that, it took like a day or two to get the arrange right.
And then, of course,
And that's I had to drop. Sorry, what?
as I was going to say, and of course, with some of the work that you were doing, you was going through COVID as well. So
Yes, absolutely.
I can imagine that didn't help you because you didn't have the opportunity of getting everybody into the studio, setting up all the equipment, doing a one-time take to see how it sounded. You're heavily reliant on sending files on emails, people doing their part, sending it back to you. I can only imagine how long that would have made the process.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely made it lengthier. I mean, instead, as I said at the beginning, in some ways it was. I mean, you never know what you would have got had we all got into the same room and done it. I mean, we've got what we've got from the circumstances and the process at the time.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of a weird one, isn't it? It's like there's nothing to say it would have been better or worse, and there's I I did quite like sort of being able to get these vocal bits in and then almost having free reign. Like I've worked with some brilliant vocalists, and no one was sort of too precious as to say you can't do this, you can't do that. I always tried to maintain their lyrics because I think that's quite important.
Yeah.
But in terms of, I've worked with Rachel before, who's absolutely fantastic, and we've always worked by. I will come up with like a little 1-2 minute backing loop. I'll send it to her, and she will sometimes do her own little arrange or just sing over the same bit but different bits. I'll get it back, and then I'll do a rearrange over using her vocal then as the guide, which happened with a few of these tracks as well. So if we were in the same room, I don't know how that process would work really.
I mean, some people say if you're in the same room, you can bounce ideas off of each other. Other people say if you're in separate rooms, you're not there and you don't get that kind of uneasy feeling, so to say.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. Yeah, I was thinking about Massive Attack. I think Mezzanine, my favourite album, at the time they weren't. They were very much writing separately, and then sort of leaving work for the next person, and the producer was maintaining it all. But obviously, it was not quite the same circumstances. But I like working both ways. But I am quite comfortable in taking stuff that I've been given and bringing it into the room. But I guess again, that's why having an external mixer was actually quite nice, because I could then send what I'd done to someone else and get their judgment on it, and just to make sure that I'm staying on the right track. So yes, I guess there is a bit of that in COVID time. It was very independent working, and there are times you just like, is this any good? I hope it's good.
Exactly. So out of all of the different job ranges out there and different career paths you could have taken at 18, 19, what made you pick this?
So when I was younger, I mean, I didn't start doing music full time until maybe about I was 29, maybe. And I'm about 42 now, for context. Might have been a year or two before that. I'd done a few bits and pieces that had been paid, but I mean, during my 20s certainly, I did a lot of sort of office temping work, and I'd always wanted to do music. That drive and passion always been there, but never quite managed to get it right. And I think it sort of started. Two things happened around the same time. One, I had a friend who was started writing for a music library, and they were looking for more artists. So he approached me. So I started doing that. And then with games, I mean, coming from sort of the Spectrum background, I'd always played games throughout my life. Obviously went into PC gaming. I sort of started to approach people. It was via forums on the internet, I think, actually, but it was around about the time that the App Store was starting to take off.
Right.
So I often kind of feel like it was right place, right time. And because I started off doing effectively the original chiptune stuff on the Spectrum, using a Spectrum, kind of used that as my in a little bit and started writing that style of music, certainly at the beginning, because it's what I did. So it was kind of, I know, again, it's a bit stereotypical, but it was just one of those things that I always wanted to do and somehow fell into a little bit. Once I got my foot in the door, you're going to events, you're working hard, you're doing all the rest of it. And
definitely. The hardest part is getting yourself established and getting people to
exactly. And I do remember there was a big crossover period where I was working sort of an office job at the time, and then my evenings were music, and that went on for a good year or two. before I could fully kind of make that commitment to go music full time. So yeah.
Right. Okay. Now, if you can remember this far back, what was the very first piece of video music that you ever created?
Oh, I mean, open for the Spectrum stuff or for games.
The very first piece of video game music that you ever did. So the very first thing that actually got into a game.
I think it was for Orange Pixel, and it was a mobile game. And I'm trying to think if it was called Ink. It's short for Incorporated. I think was the first one. I think.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Don't quote me on that, but that's where my brain's going.
That's why I say I'm sorry if it sounded like I was being a bit intrusive the way I worded.
No, not at all.
You've done that many. It's very hard to remember what your very first one was.
I think it's more just remembering the very first one because it was quite a while ago. But I think that was the one.
Okay. Now we mentioned earlier on that you've collaborated with a lot of artists for PC Building Sim and also OST. What was that like for yourself? How did that feel?
What, to collaborate with other artists on the soundtrack?
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. I think quite early on, myself and Phil decided we wanted vocals, and I can't sing, and I absolutely can't write lyrics. So I think anyone who can sing and write lyrics is an absolute genius. So, so that was immediately going to need to be bringing in other people, and where I live and some of my friends work in music, there is a community of musicians that I sort of know. So I knew I had people to call on, which was great. And then also with some of the kind of more live instrument tracks, the rock one, as opposed to the more keyboard based ones. I can play guitar. I can't play drums, but I can play guitar. I can demo stuff up. Quite nice when I'm writing a sort of the demo. I'm just doing the general chords and putting in some MIDI drums and some MIDI bass, and all sounds quite bad. But I know that I use a guy called Lorenzo who's brilliant. He's can play bass, guitar, the whole kind of lot, drums. And it was nice to know that I could just make things badly and send it off to someone else, and he'll make it sound better, if you see what I mean. So I personally really enjoy it. Again, it's another way of taking the pressure off yourself a little bit. There's a reason why a lot of musicians, when they're writing albums, a lot of bands have producers, have mixers, have session people who come in, because it just helps. And Lorenzo, when he's, for instance, I'll play a bad guitar part, but I might not put little runs or noodles or whatever you want to call them in, and he will just add that stuff in, which gives it the extra quality.
It touches on what we were saying earlier on about having that opportunity, even with, like, say, a lot of mainstream artists that are out there, having a producer or someone where you can lay something down, and then, like I said, in your mind's eye, it doesn't quite sound right, and send it off to somebody else. Especially with the collaboration of artists and stuff like that. Did that make it easier for you, or did it make it harder?
It makes it much easier for me, I think, because ultimately, I just sort of, I'm one of those people, and I don't know if this is just a creative thing, but I tend not to like or be able to listen to what I've done certainly for a period of time afterwards, but think everyone else is brilliant. So when I get stuff back from people, it's a pleasure. Like sending stuff off for vocals and then getting a track that I've created back with a vocal line on the top. It's always a pleasure. It's like, what am I going to get? And it always surprises me, and I absolutely love it. I really do.
Perfect. Okay, so out of all of the music that you created for PC Building Sim 2, what would you say was the favourite thing about making all the different kind of soundtracks and waveforms?
The amount of genres. Just, the challenge of writing in that many different genres.
Is that something you've done before, or was it completely new to you?
I mean, I've written in a few, certainly for doing the TV side of the thing. You have to, there's been sort of electronic and orchestral stuff, but this sort of to go through and we had reference tracks, sort of like it needs to sound in a similar vein to this, or similar vein to this, and so I've never listened doing sort of the heavy metal tune with vocals on, and just sussing out what makes a good heavy metal tune, if you see what I mean, or what makes a good trip hop tune. And if I'm being brutally honest, I think sometimes I nailed it better than other times. And like anything, and I'm sure anybody would say, so you listen to things, you think, oh, I'd change that now, and I'd change that now. But
Yeah.
as a complete body of work, yeah, just the amount of different genres, definitely.
Okay. Now, what was the one thing you found the most challenging about the whole process?
Probably writing in many different genres.
I thought you would say COVID restrictions.
No, I mean, again, with the COVID restrictions, it also happened at a time when I was sharing a studio space with a friend, and not long certainly in the year, I can't remember where, it might be months preceding COVID, I'd moved everything back home. So in some ways, I was perfectly set up for that situation, as much as you can be.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it did make things difficult. Sometimes it could be hard to get hold of collaborators. I mean, we've all got our own things going on, and in the same room that would have happened, it would have been getting a body of work done in one go, and I would have been able to take it all away. I think there was one track, the vocal wasn't. I mean, it was recorded to the best of the ability at the time, but in a studio that it would have been a better recording. So that was quite difficult.
Right. I mean, obviously, like I say, remote working with COVID situations and things like that, a lot of people were doing things from a room in a house that they kind of tried to make it into a studio, try to do soundproofing and things like that. Did that make it harder for you when it came to actually cutting out background sounds?
One track in particular. I mean, luckily, so most of the people I'm working with have a studio space because they're also musicians. So it didn't cause too much of an issue. There were a couple of times where, and it's no fault of the person who did the recording their end, they did the best job they could. But had we been able to get access to a decent sort of studio space altogether and get them in, then the recording would have been better and it would have made things easier. Having said that, I did my best with the recording as I've got, and then gave it to someone else to mix, and they did their best with it. So it became someone else's problem.
There's a lot of different mixing and audio software out there, and even throughout the whole COVID thing. Okay, we're now coming on to nearly 3-4 years after like COVID really putting restrictions on the UK itself. I think, pardon the phrase, but the best of a bad situation, and from what you're saying, it all came together, and at the end of it, I've played PC Building Sim 2, and listening to the soundtracks that are in there, from a player aspect, you wouldn't know it was actually all compiled in separate segments. So,
that's good.
Yeah, listening to it from a player's aspect, and obviously having the chance to sit down and have this chat with you, and I'm sure that a lot of other people that have played the game would probably agree, it doesn't sound as if it's all being done remotely. It's all come together, and you would never have guessed.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, it's as I said, I mean, I sort of worked in this way a bit pre-COVID, and even I say post-COVID. You know what I mean? It's difficult to say in today's world, but
unfortunately,
since restrictions have been lifted, we've touched upon it. You get different ideas and different things come up when you're all together. But I guess in some respects there was there was time. That's one thing I did get from it. So I could send a backing track to someone and they could record it in their own time, send it back to me, and if I did need any changes, that was always fine. And it wasn't a matter of getting together in a studio and having that time pressure on. But again, time pressure brings its own pluses and minuses. So it's just a different way of working. I think there was one track on the album where I think it was the last track we did, and it was getting a bit time pressured. That was obviously still remote working, but it also worked out fine. So yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So, last question of the whole thing here. Out of all of the different tracks that you created, especially for PC Building Sim 2, what would you say turned out to be your favourite?
Oh, I was hoping you would ask that.
If you could pick one.
It's like picking my favourite child.
Curveball question for you there.
I I'd probably pick a few, and then I'd have to narrow it down from there. I mean, again, on the floor, I really enjoy because even though I wrote it, certainly music, when I listen back to it, it still surprises me, which is a good thing. I think I'm sometimes when you listen back to or observe something you've created, you're too into the process. You remember that or the details or picking up on that little bit there or something. I mean, there's one tiny bit near the end, and I'm not going to say it in case anyone else picks up on it. I did quite a lot of live keyboard playing on it, and there's a bit where I just hear it's just a bit out of time, but then I'm really picky about that. Someone else won't notice or think it adds to the charm of it.
The problem is you've just mentioned the track and you've just mentioned that last segment, so you're going to get
someone
that's going to be sitting there now going, you know what, yeah, he's right, that does sound a bit out of tempo.
I almost feel like I should elaborate and give full no. I'll leave it up to other people. If no one can find anything, then or they want to write to me and see if they can guess the little bit. But no one else has ever said anything, and I know Jeff, who mixed it, would have pulled me up on it had it been really bad. So I think that's just me being too pedantic. I think if I'm allowed to have just a couple more quickly, I would probably have. There's a track called "Wanna Love," which has got Rachel doing vocals on it, and it's a bit of a take on kind of '90s dance, acid housey sort of stuff. And I really enjoy that one. One, because I loved writing the style, and two, because it didn't have vocals on it. It was a complete track with no vocals. And then I went back to Phil and said, I think we need vocals in this track. It just needs it. And he was like, yep, you're right. So I approached Rachel, and she did this brilliant vocal over the top of it. And I loved it, but it just didn't quite fit with the track. So then I ended up completely kind of rearranging the track behind her vocal, and it just worked. But then little bits which were written for other parts of the song got moved around, but somehow there was a lot of accidental stuff that worked. And then I think Space Raiders, which has Conscious Root on it, that was one of the first tracks done. The vocal was done quite late on in the whole writing process of the whole album, and I enjoyed that because it's not a style I normally do. And I'm probably pushing it now if I pick any more. Sunrise, I'd probably pick the other one because again that had a lot of vocal samples in it and things. And I just contacted Rachel near the end of the whole writing process for the whole soundtrack and just said this would really benefit from few just live little vocal bits, and what she sent across was perfect. No lyrics, just little melody lines and stuff, and that was brilliant.
Just bits of harmonising and things to go in there in bits and pieces.
Yeah, I spent a while trying to arrange that one as well, and it was nothing quite worked. And then just dropping her vocals bit in the end, you kind of got to be brave. Sometimes you've got to take out some of your favourite bits, which I had to do, but her vocals then elevate it to another layer. Like on actually the first track I mentioned, On the Floor, did have this amazing clarinet solo in it, a sample, which didn't make the cut in the end because I couldn't fit it in with the vocal and everything else. And I often now think I should do a version of that in because it just worked, but it didn't work with everything else that was in there. So sometimes you've got to take away stuff to get where you need to be.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you keep going back to On the Floor, and when you actually heard the full finished finalized polished version of On the Floor, it's conveying that you kind of was like, wow, did I make that?
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of that. I mean, it is probably my favourite. If I had to pick one, it would be that one. But also, this could be completely coincidental, but it has got the most keyboards on it, the most old keyboards. Right. And I did, I did my old trick on that one. There's a little, I don't know if I should give that away. A little tip: if you ever sort of write a bass line, just move everything forward a 16th of a note and just see how it sounds. And I did that on that one, and it just gives it a different groove. Um, and yeah, I'm looking around the room now, all the different keyboards using it. It's got the most. It's just got a lot of different parts. It's got some nice guitar in there.
Yeah.
It was just good, but also it was the most challenging, I think, to get the arrange right on. So when it listen back to it now, I almost forget what I did, and I'm a bit surprised by how it all works every single time, because that's not the backing that I sent to Matt, and it's definitely not the version that he did vocals over, but it just ended up being something completely different and just better.
Perfect. Right, Gavin, thanks very much for taking the time to have a chat with me this afternoon. It's been a pleasure. I really
Thank you very much.
No, not at all. I really enjoyed it. Obviously, PC Building Sim 2, you say it was a long process in regards of getting everything all worked out, but from a player's aspect, and I played PC Building Sim 1 and number 2, with the stuff we've spoken about today, obviously a lot of it was done through COVID with PC Building Sim 2. I would never have guessed that. I would never have guessed that at all. All the best for future projects, and like I say, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Not a problem at all.